So, I'd like to welcome her first of all. She's one of the people that has traveled furthest, I believe. Kate is based in Palo Alto in California. She works for a company that has made a big impact in a very short space of time. I believe it's only 3 or 4 years old, Facebook, and in its very, very short life, it has changed the life of a lot of users and a lot of people that are coming together on Facebook to interact and to meet friends and to stay in touch with the family and work colleagues too. Kate is a product manager for internationalization and localization at Facebook in Palo Alto. And she's been involved in a project that has made headlines all over the world, especially for people who are involved in the translation and localization industry. So when we received, when Kate got in touch with us, we were thrilled that she had decided to share some of the experience that Facebook went through with us, which involved about 30,000 users around the world in a project that translated aspects of Facebook into 16 launched languages and about 60 additional languages that are in the pipeline. So I'd like to ask you to very much welcome Kate Lossier as our first keynote speaker.
In only 9 months, we have gone from being a site published only in American English to a site that has been translated into 25 languages with 60 more under translation, all of which are touched and translated by the Facebook user community every single day. Any Facebook user can use the translations application to immediately begin translating Facebook strings into the language of his or her choice. And they can do this by just going to www.facebook.com/translations. I suggest that you try that out if you're interested in how this works. There's no screening to determine the user's skill level in that language or to determine whether the user knows the language at all. How then do we deliver and maintain quality to users of Facebook in every language? Before I move into my discussion of the techniques by which Facebook gauges and maintains quality in an open translation environment, I'll say something about how we decided to open our translations process up to users in the first place. We began with a hunch that it would give us good or maybe the best results, but we didn't know when we began whether it would work at all. And I'm showing you actually the first homepage for Facebook, when it was actually called The Facebook, and you'll see that it says, we have opened up the Facebook for popular consumption at Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, Yale, Cornell, Dartmouth, UPenn, MIT, and now BU and NYU. So originally, Facebook was only available at these colleges, and you could only sign up for Facebook if you had an email address with a domain that matched one of those schools. And when you signed up, the only people that could view your profile were people with that same email address or email domain. So it was very much a sort of private and kind of protected sphere, very much about the community of a particular school as opposed to a technology of sort of making yourself available to everybody on the internet. And it's still that way. So Facebook is at core a technology of community. Begun in the dorms at Harvard University in February of 2004, Facebook was created as a way for people in a close-knit, real-life community, in the earliest case, the Harvard dorms, to share information about themselves with the people around them. Facebook proved to be immediately highly useful to its users. Because rather than having to rely on chance encounters in the hallways or at the pub in the midst of busy, changing course schedules, students could learn more about each other online when it was convenient, and then use that as a stepping stone to richer, more informed conversations offline. gradually introduced, and the pace of releases of new ways to post content and interact with each other have continued to the present. One thing has remained constant, though. Facebook has always been basically a frame and a tool through which users post content and communicate with one another, whether in the form of messages, photos, videos, status updates, and so forth. So given that the content of Facebook is largely the production of Facebook users, it wasn't a huge leap to think about opening the translation process up to the users, to let the users in a particular locale, in essence, produce the interface itself. It took our engineers several months to convert the site into translatable strings and develop the application through which the strings could be translated by users. So this is the Facebook translations application, which we launched first in December of 2007 for the language of Spanish. Was the first one. Upon first release of the application, there was immediate criticism that the application was built solely to save Facebook money. This wasn't how we were thinking about it, though. Our main concern in creating the translations application was this. If Facebook is a tool to share information with everyone you know, the tool is richest and most useful when everyone you know can use it. So it follows that we must make Facebook available in as many languages as possible. Because limiting the languages in which Facebook is available limits the amount of content and connections that can be made on the site, and could potentially keep whole communities and whole sets of connections out of the conversation. Therefore, it was important that our localization process be able to scale to every language, not just the most economically or demographically powerful ones. Another reason that we wanted to open the translations process up to users was that for a technology as new and as constantly evolving as Facebook has been, we thought that it wouldn't necessarily be the case that a professional translator coming to the site cold would know best how to translate it. Prior to translation, the Facebook user base was limited largely to users in the US, the UK, and Canada. We figured that tech-savvy, early adopter users of the site in other countries could be more apt translators of the site than a professional translator who had never used the product. For example, a term like mini-feed is a Facebook neologism. How does somebody who has never seen or used a mini-feed know how to translate it? The only way to compose a translation is to be acutely aware in practice of the product's function, which is something that only existing users can do. And also because Facebook has an informal tone, we thought that it might prove hard for professional translators to replicate that tone in translation, especially when linguists are used to translating more formal material, typically. It seemed that a community of users who are very familiar with the tone and the product, as well as their native slang, would have a better chance of writing translations that sounded natively authentic. So for these reasons, we thought that it would be optimal to let the users translate, provided that we could assure a high level of quality of the launched product. Because while it's possible to hire professionals to translate the interface into the major languages, supporting a locale requires a budget and a business justification. By building the tools to allow a small language community to maintain its own locale on the site, we thought that we could enable even speakers of the smallest languages to use Facebook along with everyone else, thus fulfilling the Facebook mission of helping everyone to be more connected with the people in their lives. So the basic format of our translations application is simple. Users simply add the application, select their language, and then click on Go Translate, where they are taken to a page that looks like this. So you'll see that we basically surface strings for translation simply by clicking on the pencil icon that says Translate. A translation dialog box pops up where the user can type in a translation and then click Translate. And then proceed to the next one. So it's pretty simple. We also have an interface that allows the user to translation list that the user sees a description, but they don't actually see their translation in context. Here, if they click on the underlining, the translation box opens up, they can enter the translation, and you can be pretty sure that that's probably going to be very accurate based on its placement on the page, which they can see. So once we have translations coming into the system through the application, the next question is, how do we optimize for quality while we're allowing anyone and everyone to translate? How do we know which translations are good and which translations are bad? One of the filtering techniques that has been used on the web for several years is that of user evaluation of the quality of a given post or contribution. And you see this all over the web, sites like Dig, TripAdvisor, etc. This type of user input was our first step in filtering translations by level of their quality. So for each string, we allow and encourage users to submit a vote for the best translation of that string, and to vote down the translations that are not correct or are suboptimal. The aggregate of these votes allows us to know programmatically which strings the community considers best. And once a given translation crosses a threshold of positive votes, we consider it approved and publish it. So here you see the voting interface as applied in our pirate locale, which we released a few weeks ago, sort of just for fun. It turned out to be rather successful. You'll see that here we have the string hometown with a variety of translations that have been submitted by the community in pirate language. We have birth, we have where you pop, which might be a bit vulgar even for the pirate locale. We have some variations on port of origin. So there are different capitalizations and spellings, but the community has decided that port O origin is the most authentic and correct translation of hometown for the pirate language. So they can click on the arrows to say that they approve. They can click down to say which translations they don't approve. And then after you vote, you see what the community has voted on. So 12 people have voted for port O origin. One person has voted down, and that's currently the winning translation. So we realized quickly that the user voting data not only tells us which translations are of the highest quality, it also tells us which translators typically produce the best translations. So we wrote algorithms that track the vote data for each translator and weight their translations. Thus, the translators that consistently score higher are given higher weight when they translate and vote on other translations. Thus, the system is always moving towards a higher and more intelligent filter for translations, even if the translations entering the system range anywhere from atrocious to excellent. We also display a leaderboard of the winning translators for each locale. And there's some pretty interesting information here. So we rate the leading translators by the number of winning strings that they've translated. So that means that we're basically ranking them by both quantity and quality of their translations. And it's typically the case that the people at the very top of the leaderboard have translated many, many strings, and many more than people who are just a few spaces down on the leaderboard. And what this does is that it tells you that the people who are very good at this and who are doing lots and lots of work are probably contributing greatly to the quality, because the more work they do, the more they learn about the translation, the sort of state of translation in that locale, and the more leadership they provide to the community about which terms are good and what kinds of translation decisions the community should be making. And we have a discussion forum in the application where these leaders typically end up sort of moderating the translations by answering user questions about what to do and what are the best translations to contribute. You'll see that Brian, this is the author Locale, Brian Geldenhuis has ensure voting coverage on all strings, we programmatically surface random and less popular strings in the voting interface to ensure that all strings, even the least popular, appear to users for voting. Going into the translation process, we anticipated that one of the biggest issues for translation quality when many people are translating would be consistency. Obviously, for a site that relies on ease of navigation in order to efficiently surface content to users, it is important that all navigation elements be named consistently. So the wall, for example, must always be called the wall, or else it will appear to be two products when it's actually just one, and that would be really confusing to users. We also knew that the key terms needed to be decided in advance of the general translation effort, so that every translation that used a particular term would hopefully use the right term for that feature. So we created a glossary of important product terms, and created a glossary phase that precedes the general translation phase. In the glossary phase, users can translate and vote on glossary terms until the glossary has been decided. Then, when they go into the general translation phase, we automatically remind users to use the glossary terms every time they go to translate a string that contains one of those terms. This helps to enforce consistency on all of the important product terms. So for the first language that we prepared to launch, which is Spanish, we didn't have the time or the resources to conduct an assessment of the quality delivered by the community. We actually had no professionals involved on the first launch. We actually just had some students from Stanford who were native speakers of Spanish come in on the weekends to just read over the translations and sanity check to make sure that it wasn't a total disaster. And they made a few corrections, but they weren't professional linguists by any means. And then we launched. Actually, it was interesting because once Spanish had launched, the feedback that we received in the blogosphere and also from people who anecdotally talked to us about the translation is that the major issues were things like typos in the Spanish locale, which suggested on the positive side that there weren't huge semantic issues in the translation that made it difficult to use. So while we prefer to have no typos, the fact that typos were the few things that people were complaining about was actually reassuring. But having been a writer and an editor prior to working at Facebook, I knew that all writing, even that done by one person, usually benefits from an editor prior to publication. So I guess it would be a good idea to perform evaluations of translations prior to launch if we could do that. So for French and German, we engaged professional linguists to complete a one-week review of the translations prior to launch. Anecdotally, they reported to us that the biggest causes of errors were in the areas of terminological consistency and mechanics. However, we did not have time to quantitatively assess these issues to quantify how many, what kind, and what percentage of translation issues compose the overall set. So our next question was, how do we really know if the system is working in quantitative terms? After the initial pace of launches slowed, we had some time to perform an evaluation of the quality of the translations for our Welsh locale. And we did this prior to doing any editing of the translations. We asked a professional linguist to review the 7,000 most used strings on the site and to assess their quality. We gave the linguist a spreadsheet containing all of the translations and asked her to rate them on a scale of A for perfectly acceptable, B for acceptable but could be improved, and F for failed. We asked her to comment and specify the type of errors for the strings that had problems. The results of the evaluation for Welsh actually turned out to be very encouraging. Out of all of the strings that were reviewed, 84% were rated A, for perfectly acceptable, 10% were rated B, which meant they could be improved in some way but were okay, and only 3% were rated F, for failure. 4% were missing enough context to allow the linguist to determine if the translation was correct or not. She was working from a spreadsheet. So the fact that the user community, without any professional help or oversight, translated to a 94% acceptable rate was very, very good news. And one question that became relevant as soon as we began hiring professionals to review the work of the community was this. Do professionals always produce higher translation quality than the community? Often, the professional reviewers that we hired to work on the QA process were using Facebook for the first time. And I had to do a lot of work with them to explain what certain product terms meant, which was something that the user who was already a power user of the site and then going to translate wouldn't need. The places where the professionals excelled, obviously, were in correcting for mechanical errors and consistency. But in terms of the tone and understanding of the product, the community translations were frequently better. In fact, we sometimes saw complaints from our community translators in the discussion forum after we had done a QA review. And the interesting thing about this is that the community would obviously never complain about corrections for typos or mechanical issues. In fact, they wouldn't notice them. You wouldn't really notice if something had an error and now didn't. So the things that they were complaining about were situations where they knew that the tone had changed. So they had sort of, as a community, adopted a certain voice. And suddenly, the translation reads differently in some way that they can identify, but they can't point to what actually necessarily changed because there's something different and something that they don't like. And so we actually saw complaints of that nature after our reviews had been completed. An analysis of professional edits of community translations from the simplified Chinese locale bore out this situation. We asked a professional linguist to review a set of simplified Chinese translations and make corrections when deemed necessary. We then had a Facebook engineer who speaks simplified Chinese natively and is an expert in the Facebook product to evaluate the corrections that were made by the linguist. According to the Chinese engineer, 60% of the corrections made by the linguist made the translations better, and 40% of the edits made by the professional made the translations worse. In most cases, also, either translation was okay, and it was just a choice of one being slightly better than the other. This suggests that the percentage of strings corrected by professional linguists during QA may not actually reflect the percentage of severe translation issues on the site. We also did an evaluation prior to launching the Turkish language. Based on an export, again, of 7,000 strings, we found that the Turkish professional linguists made changes to only 25% of the strings that had been positively voted by the community at the threshold level. So it's not just that they received one positive vote, but that enough people had decided that this was good for us to approve it. The changes that the Turkish linguists made varied from the minute to the significant. But again, the question remains, were all of these edits necessary? Because while some of the edits for mechanics, spelling, etc. are definitely necessary, some editing becomes merely an act of rewriting, sometimes based on less acute awareness of the product, rather than a necessary intervention into translations that may be perfectly acceptable. That said, it is clear that some number of translation issues persist through the voting process. So the question for quality in our environment is to quantify what types of errors persist through the voting, how serious are they for quality, and how can we fix them programmatically if possible. For Welsh, the top classes of errors that we identified based on the spreadsheet that was returned to us by the professional were, number one, terminological consistency, as predicted. Second was capitalization and mechanics. Third, typing errors. And four, actually, were code issues. So English obviously has, well, I'm sure has and we don't have that now in the glossary. So we want to make the glossary, we want to expand it so it can include as many terms as the community thinks should be there. We want to make it flexible by locale, so not all languages dispute certain terms. In some languages, there's much dispute over a particular term, so we want to be able to add terms to the glossary on a flexible basis, depending on which terms in that locale are often disputed. We also want to make it possible to conjugate glossary terms so that users know how every form of that term should appear in the interface. So they don't always use the same version of the term everywhere on the site. Sometimes it's conjugated. If we could list those as sort of in a parent-child relationship within the glossary, then users would always know how to translate a particular term. And then, of course, we want to always check for the glossary term usage at the point of translation, which we currently do. But what makes that hard now is that if a user conjugates the term, we show a message saying, you didn't use the glossary term, when in fact they did, but it's a slightly different form. So we're kind of giving them error messages that we shouldn't. If we can correct for that, that would be great. We do, as I said, we do lots of error checking currently at the point of translation, but anything we can do to make that system more sophisticated, to include different types of checks, is always good. And of course, if we could add a spell checker to prevent typos in each language, that would be fantastic. We know that technology is available, and one of our engineers claims to be able to know how to build that, but he's very busy working on other things right now, which is always the problem at Facebook. And then for the code issues, where the English strings actually don't make it possible to translate the phrase correctly in another language, we're actually undertaking an ongoing project of exploding many strings on the site so that they can be inflected by gender in languages that require that. We also have something called dynamic explosion, which allows us to add rules that a particular language, other than English, has for inflection to that particular locale, so that when a user goes to translate, they see more options and can explode that string multiple ways to get all of the inflections correct. So these are the things that we're currently working on to make the Facebook Translations application more powerful and to deliver even better quality for our users. These capabilities will become increasingly important as we move into launching languages that we don't have any editorial support for. But until we solve all of these translation issues programmatically, we have another solution to deliver perfect quality in the old-fashioned way, which is what we call our admin panel. This is a capability that is available only to sort of super users of our application, which are people that we've identified as linguists or people with linguistic skill that we've approved to edit translations. And they see a very efficient interface of translations that they can edit very quickly and approve quickly simply by clicking on the field, editing, pressing return, and clicking approve on translations that need no editing. So using this interface, they can translate or edit and also translate many, many strings very quickly. So I'll leave you with a screenshot of some of the entertaining translations from the pirate locale, and then I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, David. Fascinating presentation. Lots of interesting stuff there. I'm sure there will be so many questions that we won't have the time to go through all of them, but we take some. One, turn, 2, 3, 4.
So I'm Warwick Sheridan from CNGO. Do you know what percentage of the Facebook users have participated in the translation application?
It's in the tens of thousands. It was 30,000 when I actually submitted my proposal for the conference, but we've since
time it takes them or the number of errors they make when they are in the admin panel?
So the admin panel is for the professional.
You don't measure there how many changes they actually make to the translation.
We don't, but that's actually a really good idea. Yeah. We've actually been, originally before we had this the sophisticated admin panel interface, we were actually doing a lot of the QA in Excel files because we didn't have that capability yet. This was sort of version 2 of the application that we started working with about in late summer. So that would be really useful data. I'm sure our engineer can build that.
And is the time when people either translate or edit each string, do you measure the time it takes them?
No, we don't. Yeah.
Sure.
My name is Sharon O'Brien from Dublin City University. So a lot of research in translation suggests that bilinguals are not as good at translating as trained professional translators. But your experience seems to suggest that that's not true. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Again, it's important to note that within a given locale, the skill level of the translators varies everywhere from excellent to terrible. So I think it's definitely true that somebody who's bilingual could be a very poor translator. They could also be very good. I think in our first translations efforts, we noticed that most of the people who were translating, because of the nature of the demographic of Facebook, were people who were bilinguals, and sometimes they had more confidence in their ability to translate than they probably should have had. But that's sort of what the voting interface is designed to help moderate. So I think as Facebook becomes more local in some of these locales, as more people who are native speakers, native users, maybe they're not as good in English as they are in their native language, I imagine that we would actually see the quality improve, because if they're translating into their native language, obviously being very, very good at their native language is probably the best for us in terms of quality, as opposed to somebody who's kind of like an expat and speaks English primarily, but the other language secondarily.
Hi, my name is Benjamin, I'm a student at UL. You actually almost answered my question now. I was just going to ask you, like, from what I understood, when Facebook was not translated, most users were English speakers. Right? So I was just wondering if, like, when the translation process started, I suppose most people that were translating were English speakers. Did you have any way of checking, like, if they were native speakers of the language they were translating to, or did you take that into account, or you?
And we thought, but once we realized that the native people who were native speakers were much, much better at translating than the people who had, taken the language in school or gone there and studied abroad, we almost wanted to institute some kind of barrier, but of course that would make it really, well, first of all, it'd be incredibly hard to do that. I don't know how we could, and also that would probably defeat the fun of it, which is part of the whole project. Is that for a lot of people, it's just something that's fun to do. Somebody in the Japanese locale commented on the forum that it was like a video game, so she would go around looking for the English words and then translate them. And she was like getting upset because there were no more words to translate. So she was like seeking
I'm Tony Yevtushenko. I'm with Product Innovator Limited. First, I want to congratulate you on your selection of Dublin as your international headquarters. Welcome. As an American expat here, I think you made a great decision. But the other thing, I have many questions, but I'll just hone in on just one or two. I have a two-pronged question. Political issues, you must encounter them. And for example, with Taiwan, China, for example. I know Microsoft years ago had a dictionary problem. They hired some professional translators, and they translated the term, the acronym PLA, as something like blood-sucking vampire or something like that. You got in trouble for it. How do you deal with that? The second issue is, do you actually have a government censor on board in China evaluating things?
No, not our translations process. I can't speak really to our surviving through that review process.
I guess your perspective of what's offensive might be very different based upon where you live.
Yes.
So especially political issues can touch you, I think.
Right, and so that's the thing.
I see.
If anything, that's probably what helps us, is that people can contribute anything. And so sometimes you would have competing problematic translations. So there's not really a political voice that's being expressed here, other than the one of the particular user. This is that translation. So it's not as though we are allowing one person to take this over and use it as their political platform, because anybody can come in and say something with a competing viewpoint. So in that sense, it's a lot just like the internet. You see all kinds of things, and people seem to understand that. So
you're definitely the last question.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I've got lots of questions, and I just give you three, and you pick and choose which one you really want to answer. The first one is like, how many strings do you have for each language? Second one is, how long does it take from sort of like opening up the translation portal to you going online in a particular language on average? It probably varies quite a bit. And the third one is part of the, would you think that part of the success of what you've been doing is by almost turning translation into a game, sort of like, banking on the enthusiasm and motivation of Facebook users anyway, and then you add a little bit that actually almost turns it into a game?
yeah, to your last point, definitely. The fact that Facebook users are so passionate about this product has been incredibly helpful to us, obviously. We've seen the reaction by the users to everything we've done with this product has always been extremely vocal, extremely passionate, going back to when we released the newsfeed, which many people hated in its initial instantiation. But of course, if they hate it, there's obviously lots of emotion and excitement about it. So I think that we've been able to capitalize on that excitement in order to deliver translations. In terms of the time, that varies very much. The French site was actually translated in 1 day, but of course we needed to make sure it was okay, because it had been translated so fast that we worried that the quality would be poor. So we spent about a month just letting it settle and letting people vote and so forth. And number of strings. Ghassan, do you know the number?
I'm Ghassan Haddad. I also work at Facebook. We actually have 3 components that are translatable. You have the UI, which is composed of about 24,000 strings, approximately 110,000 words. We have online help, which we originally opened up for translation by the community, but because of the length of each string, we noticed that there were lots of translations where the translator started and then, excuse me for bad language, the last 2 words of the translation was screw this, I don't want to continue. So we actually blocked that from community translation. They can translate, but we don't use that translation. Help is also approximately 100,000 words. There's a legal component which we also initially allowed the community to translate, but because of the sensitive nature of the content, we actually do a professional review of that one. And then there's a component that's basically more like for support. We call it canned responses.
May I ask my question now? Do you think this is scalable? You already mentioned that when the string gets longer, it becomes more difficult to translate, which I suppose Sharon would find particularly surprising. Is it possible for me, if I have a newsfeed, is it possible for my friends to translate this newsfeed, say, in Chinese? Do you see it really expanding to cover the whole content of Facebook, not just control strings?
I'm not sure.
The process we put in place actually makes it very scalable. So we have a hybrid solution where we allow the community to do translations, and then we have a professional that takes over at some point. So if there are things that are incomplete, they would complete it.
So you think it is scalable?
Absolutely. And we've been doing that for the last 9 months. We haven't missed anything, so.
Follow-up question or just a new one?
Yep, it's a new one.
Maybe that's the very last one. Maybe the last one's very last.
Yeah.
No, we have to let anybody else.
on both the strings themselves, and also you have a glossary created by the community, managed by the community. So basically the community is managing the terminology. We also mentioned that you also QA, or you have linguists that you hire, professional linguists, to check the quality of the translation. Do you also check, or do you control, does this linguist control the terminology as well, or do they manage the terminology, or do you just let the community manage the terminology and have the translators, the linguists, when they're reviewing, the translators say, this is actually the glossary that the community created, follow it, whatever, even if you think it's horrible, rubbish, follow it. So basically my question is the terminology managed 100% by the community, or do you allow professional translators to actually clean that up or manage the
So we actually instruct the linguists when we have them do the QA that we do not want them to change the glossary unless there's something egregiously wrong with it. We want them to follow what the community recommended because we trust the community knows what the translation should be. Of course, we're always open to discussion. I always love to hear what the linguist has to say about a given term, but we won't change it unless there's a really, really good reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the very last question, the other before you go there, unless you can, because you have to go to the slide back.
The reason I was asking about the strings and the number of words is so you can quantify the professional cost of localizing a user interface that has 25k strings for 100,000 words, and then multiply that by the amount of languages that you want to localize in. And so given that, do you have an estimate of how much money this process saved you, as offset by the engineering that is required to put the sort of like, the crowdsourcing platform in place? Did you ever look into that?
I mean, my sense of things is actually that probably break even generally, at least at this point. But XIII is more, he's been in this business longer than I have, so he probably knows what the real cost would have been.
Yeah, we haven't really done a real thorough analysis of that one. I just want to comment on one thing. You said the cost of engineering. I've been in localization for 25 years, so I'm not really, this is not my first time doing localization. So I've worked in a traditional environment for many years. It actually, the technology that we have really ends up saving a tremendous amount of money. I'll give you an example. So for all these languages, we have actually only 2 employees. It's K-9. We don't have any localization engineers. We don't have any project managers. We have a couple of linguists in-house. So the technology itself has saved a tremendous amount of money in terms of the actual process. In terms of the actual translation, I would imagine there's a little bit of saving, savings, but we haven't done any quantification to that one.
All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. As I said, there must be hundreds of questions. A few to them. I'm very sorry that I can't answer. Again, thank you very much for the excellent presentation.